Number one, severance. God says, first of all, when we get married, we need to leave our parents. We need to sever the emotional umbilical cord. We need to do this so we can build a Marthon marriage with our spouse. The idea is not to stop communication from your family, stop talking to your parents. That's not what it's about. But rather what it's saying is you need to have an allegiance with your spouse. That allegiance changed from what your parents has influenced you all these years. The allegiance is now with the spouse that you are married to. Building block number 2 is permanence. You see, God says after you leave, you need to be committed to permanence. This word joined or cleaned means you are glued together. It means literally to melt two separate entities so that together they form a permanent bond, or a weldedness together. Folks, too many of us are allowing our relationships to become unglued. Third thing I see here, and I know I could have used leave, cleave, and weave, but I think that word weave isn't enough. So I've divided it up into oneness and intimacy. You see, God says the next to all of this, the two are to become one flesh. This phrase conveys the idea of a partnership, a oneness. The hearts and lives are knit together. This unity is to be experienced both emotionally, spiritually, and physically. God's objective for marriage is a loving relationship of oneness. Matthew 19 and verse 6. So then they no longer are two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Intimacy. Look at verse 25. Could we have left that part out? Did it really have anything to do with marriage? I think it does. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. You see, intimacy means knowing what there is and accepting it when all the covering, whether it's physical covering, emotional covering, intellectual covering, or spiritual covering, when all that covering is stripped away, intimacy means accepting each other. Marriage is designed to be intimate. No hiding your flaws. No more. Marriage makes you vulnerable. I'm convinced that's why some folks just choose not to get married. They refuse to become vulnerable. See, I'm putting this mask on. And I'll let you in this part of my life, but not that part. I'm convinced that's why so many marriages break apart. Vulnerability. Some men have such pride that when they get in trouble at work, when they lose their jobs, they just cannot tell their spouse. When some men get to a place in their life where they can no longer do the one things they once did, that vulnerability is where men can't handle it. Same thing for wives. We've got to be vulnerable. And if we truly love Jesus, and we have truly invited Jesus into our marriage, we've allowed Him to become interested in our marriage, and we've seen His involvement in our marriage, vulnerability won't be the issue anymore. Sandy knows I'm not the strong, good-looking guy that I was when she married me 32 years ago. And I know she's changed over the years. Our marriage works because we're vulnerable. We love each other, and we're willing to accept each other in all areas of our lives. Ecclesiastes. Solomon wrote Song of Songs, and We saw that romance earlier, but let's look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9 and 10. You see, two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. My wife has lifted me up through those 32 years. And there's times I've been there to lift her up, encourage, edify. But woe to him that is alone when he falls. He has no one to help him up. Solomon wrote this description. And he continues in verse 12. You see, he sees here in verse 12, though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, but a threefold cord is not easily broken. That chain that I showed the kids earlier. Who's the third part of that marriage that will strengthen it? It's got to be Jesus. You've got to have Christ in the middle of that relationship. He is the one that will strengthen your marital relationship. As you open yourselves up to Christ, as you surrender yourself to His leadership, as you submit to Jesus in your life, your marriage will be healed. He'll give you a fresh start. He'll give your marriage strength. As your marriage moves through the various seasons, the ideal of romance, the ordeal of reality, the new deal of rethinking, you really can have a new deal. You don't have to settle for the blogs. You don't have to bail on your marriage. If you are with Jesus and in Jesus, you can cultivate this relationship. You can base and build your marriage according to His specifications. I'm going to ask us to stand. I'm going to ask if your spouse is here to get wherever they are and hold that spouse's hand. So let's all stand. I want to pray a prayer of recommitment. Some of you might be here today saying my marriage is perfect, and that's good. Some of you might be saying that I've already leaved and cleaved. I've already had a oneness, come up here, sweetie, and an intimacy. I want to pray for healing in your marriage. I want to pray for yourself to surrender yourselves to Christ in your marriage. I want to ask you to ask your spouse, do you see Jesus in me? Boy, now we're getting vulnerable. I'm well aware that there are some folks here today that are widows or widowers. And I'm going to ask you to thank God for the good times in that marriage. And then I'm going to ask you to become vulnerable in your good marital relationship. As a widow or widower, you can be a mentor to so many in need. Ask God to make you vulnerable. Open yourself up. God said, I'll be a husband to those without a husband, a father to those without a father. Become vulnerable in that relationship. Become willing to mentor. I also know there's some folks here that have been divorced. I understand that. I'm going to ask you to pray that God would fill that void in your life. That He would become the spouse, that companion you need. Father, thank you for your Son, Jesus. Father, thank you for this helpmate that you have blessed me with. And Lord, my prayer is that she sees Jesus in me. And Lord, when she doesn't, that she'll lovingly come beside me and remind me to get back into your word. Remind me to take that God-given position of leader of our home,